Today, we go back in time to change, and learning about what you can and cannot control. Welcome to Equal Matters. Realism, depth, and knowledge, that's what we're after here on Equal Matters. Thank you for being here. That, with the intro, my main man, Cal the Guitar Hero, his band, the Color 8 Band, currently on a nationwide tour. That is, if you're catching us in October of 2023. Change. Hard to do. Change happens all the time, and most companies, most of us aren't good at it. For me, I have fortunately changed many times in my life. There was a 7-year period where I moved to 6 different states in search of a career, trying to get on somewhere that I could stay. And in 2007, one of those big changes I made is I moved to Phoenix. So I'll give you a little bit of backstory. I've mentioned it before here on Equal Matters. In 2003, I moved to the city of New Orleans. That was a big change for me because that was the first time I'd ever moved knowing no one. I had talked to my boss for about an hour. He offered me the job. I accepted. 6 weeks later, I moved there. And that was an adjustment. Anytime you move somewhere not knowing a soul, it forces you out of your comfort zone. Because you have to learn how to make friends. You have to learn how to navigate a new city. And in New Orleans, you had to learn how to say words like chapatulas. And that was the third move I've made in my life, which is also interesting because the first 21 years of my life was spent in the same house, essentially minus the college dorm years for a couple of years. But I lived in a small town on a small street in Hanson, Massachusetts. So at the age of 22, after graduating college, I decided to move to Florida. Mrs. Hunter was living there, so was my aunt. So I had a bit of a safety net and ended up there getting my first job at a radio station, which is the career that I chose. So that was a big change, to move away from the place that you'd lived, the only place that you called home, and try something new. And that wasn't working out because I wasn't getting paid a lot of money. I knew I needed to make another change, so I moved back to Massachusetts. And when I moved back to Massachusetts, I continued to apply for jobs because I was still working at the time mostly behind the scenes. In Gainesville, Florida, my first job, I had a weekend sports show. And I would fill in for the main talk show host, but I was in search of my own show. So after going back home and getting a couple of different jobs, one at a radio station in Boston, one at the college that I went to, Emerson College, I was working at their radio station, I applied for this job in New Orleans. Just sent down a CD, and lo and behold, got the job. And in moving to New Orleans, that's when I went all in. That's when I decided that this is exactly what I'm going to do. And 2 years into that job, Hurricane Katrina happened. The job was gone. It took me 8 months, and I ended up in a small town, small city, Farmington, New Mexico. And at the time, this was very difficult for me. It was 2006. I didn't have the tools that I have today, so I was a bit lost. Being a bit lost and being alone, again, in another place where I didn't know anybody, gives you a lot of time to think, a lot of time to process, a lot of time to figure out your next steps. So after 10 months of being in Farmington, I moved to Phoenix. It was the first week of January 2007. Yet another change. As I mentioned, the 6th state that I lived in 7 years. There was a short stop in Atlanta, Georgia after Katrina because Mrs. Hunter's company put her up there. So all these changes led to me making a different one. Now, this one, coming to Phoenix, was a bit different. And this ties into not only change, but it ties into the Stoic principle of the dichotomy of control. What you can control and what you can't. And the answer is really simple. The only thing you can control is you. Your thoughts, what you say, how you say it, and what you do. And you got to react to everything or be proactive to everything else that happens in life. And moving to Phoenix, in dealing with this change, this is what the process was for me to fully understand that. So 2007, banner year. And I remember driving down from Farmington to Phoenix, and I remember how excited I was because I loved Farmington. Not at the time. I do now because the people there are absolutely amazing. The people that I interacted with are just truly special people. But I knew that that wasn't going to be my home for long term. And I've been trying to get onto this station in Phoenix with 2 other jobs before getting the third one. So it felt amazing, even though I had to take a step backwards career-wise, because in Farmington, I was the program director, the boss of the talk station up there, and I hosted the morning show, co-hosted it with Dorothy Nobis, who helped radio for me be fun again. But I knew that this is not where I was meant to stay, so moving to Phoenix, I took a producer position, a behind-the-scenes position, because this was something that I could do. And Phoenix, in the radio industry, is what we call a major market. A lot of people live here. It's the big leagues of radio. So the job that I originally applied for was to be a talk show host in Phoenix. So I drove down from Farmington in June of 2006, and I did, I think, 2 or 3 days of tryouts. And at the end of those tryouts, I remember the boss, Russ, he said to me, he said, "You did well. However, I think I was just about to turn 28, or I had just turned 28. So you don't have enough life experience for what we need." And I was like, man, blow to the ego, right? I'm like, I have plenty of life experience. But now that I'm 45, I look between 28 and 45 and how much more life experience I have. I'm like, oh, okay, I finally understood what he meant by that. But Russ ended up hiring Darrell Ankarlo. And if you've been rocking with me a long time, that was my introduction to Phoenix. Darrell was a special talent. He had worked in major markets most of his life. He had moved from Dallas, Fort Worth, which is bigger than Phoenix. He had worked on a nationwide network for a time. So I took the job because Darrell was so unique. And in our job interview, I flew down to Phoenix on a Sunday and took a cab to the radio station. I met with Russ, who was the boss. And then after an hour or two, Darrell came by and he picked me up. My job audition for Darrell was unlike any other job audition I've ever been on. We drove around. As we were driving around, my mother called. And I pick up the cell phone. I look at him. Oh, it's my mother. I'll call her later. She says, no, answer it right now. So I answer the phone. Darrell talks to my mother and asks my mother, should I hire your son? It was quite funny, but that's Darrell in a nutshell. Ironically, many years later, 16, I live about 1.3 miles from Darrell's old house. It's funny how that works. Darrell no longer lives here in Phoenix. We'll get into that at a later date. But in this job interview, not only did he talk to my mother, he took me in the store. It's an electronics store called Fry's Electronics that no longer exists. And we're walking down the aisles, and Darrell's basically throwing things up in the air, seeing how I'll react. So I catch the items that he's throwing my way. I put it back on the shelf, all while he's asking me questions about what I like to do and how good I am at radio or what types of radio is good. So at the end of it, he drops me back off at the radio station. I caught all the items he threw my way, and then I met up with Russ again and then went back to the airport, flew back to Albuquerque, then drove 3.5 hours north to Farmington. Turns out I got that job. And again, it was the third job I had applied for. First was to be a talk show host. The second was to be in the news department. That didn't work out either, but producing Darrell Ankarlo's show behind the scenes was an opportunity. Sometimes you have to take a step back to take a step forward. So step back professionally. You go from on the air to off behind the scenes. Most people don't do that. But it sensed like to me a great opportunity. And it turned out that it was, because that step back professionally was a major step forward in my own growth. Not only did I get to learn from one of the best that's ever done it, Darrell Ankarlo, who enhanced my storytelling ability, got me to think bigger about what radio broadcasting could be. We started on this really epic adventure. It ended in 2019 when Darrell was in a car accident and suffered a traumatic brain injury. Did I say 2019? I'm ahead of myself. It ended in 2009. So we had about a 2-year run together. But what we did in those 2 years on the Darrell Ankarlo Show was things most radio stations do not do. So in 2007, I moved here. It's the first week of January, and we start working together. The major issue at the time was migration. I mean, Arizona's a border state. There were rallies, there were protests, there were all kinds of activities related to that. So we would go out and we would broadcast live from protests or rallies. And then I had this idea. Since we are so close to the border, why don't we go to the border? And Darrell was like, yes. So Darrell took that idea and he made something amazing out of it. And this was an incredibly eye-opening experience for me. Not only was it so fascinating to see firsthand the United States border in 2007, which is vastly different than it is in 2023, we got to do something no one had ever done. We broadcast in Mexico. We talked to human smugglers, technically teenagers that were, I guess, outlooks for smuggling operations. We were standing on a hillside in Mexico with them, watching them direct people into the United States. And it wasn't that they were directing people. They were watching the Border Patrol cars. And we're standing right there. You couldn't do that now because back then, 2007, it was just organizations that controlled the flow of people. Now, it's the drug cartels. It's much more dangerous to do what we did, but eye-opening. So we spent a couple of days on the Mexican side of the border, and then we came onto the United States side of the border, and we kept going back and forth, back and forth. And in 2007, we end up in this small town. So on the southern border, there is an Arizona town called Sasabe. On the other side of the border, in Mexico, it's El Sasabe. So we go to El Sasabe, we cross the border legally, and almost immediately after you get through the Border Patrol checkpoint, the paved road becomes a dirt road. And as we're driving into this little small town across the border, we drive by this building, and there's a couple hundred people in there. And it's daylight. They got jugs of water. Look like they've been traveling for a while. They were waiting for nightfall to cross in the United States. That Border Patrol checkpoint that we drove through, half a mile from there, is where everybody snuck in. And it wasn't hard. Railroad ties with a fence might go up to your hip. And there was barbed wire, which in many places had been cut. So people just walked in and walked through the desert. And while we're in this little town of El Sasabe, we go up to this hilltop because we're getting a vantage of the border. So we're looking around, looking at where the United States is and where people would cross into it. And we notice these military Humvees coming our way. So we're like, well, we probably should get off this hill, get down to the bottom of it, and see what's happening. So we get in the Jeep, which is driven by our engineer, Gary. We drive down the hill. By the time we get to the bottom of it, there's all the members of the Mexican military in their Humvees getting out of their cars with their rifles. And I remember sitting there in this moment. For some reason, I was not scared. I was thrilled. Because this is an adventure. This is what storytelling is all about. This is really the essence of what radio broadcasting can be. So in May of 2007, sitting there surrounded by the Mexican military, I'm almost grateful that I've made this move to Phoenix because now I get to do things that I never even thought was possible. Now I get to tell stories and be present to places most radio stations wouldn't allow you to go to because they don't want to spend the money. Well, at the time, this station, they did. Because our border trip ended fine. Thankfully, we're not arrested, even though we were surrounded by the Mexican military. See, we were smart. So Gary was our engineer. He was basically the wheelman. He was also the one that allowed us to broadcast remotely. Gary was very smart. We had good equipment. We were able to make it work. Darrell was the host. He was there with us. His son, Adam, in the Marine Corps, or fresh out of the Marine Corps at the time, he was like our security guard. And then we had our translator with us, a guy named Alonzo. It was Alonzo and Darrell that went and talked to the Mexican military members and got us out of that troubling situation. But it felt like I was so alive. And I go back to this idea of change because change can be a risk. It's something new. But sometimes when you make that change, you get to have this moment or many moments in which you really feel alive. Like I did even though I was surrounded by the Mexican military. But it's going through these changes that allows you to change more and do it confidently, which is something I was really beginning to grasp in 2007, 28 into 29, as my age was, working on this big-time talk show. And it dawned on me way later in life that I can control how I change. I can control my decision-making. And for some reason, when it came to my career, my path, my calling, whatever we want to call it, I always knew how to change. And I attribute that to wanting it, to feeling purpose behind it. So moving for the sixth time in 7 years, sixth state in 7 years, I'd become pretty good at it. I've been pretty good at going into new places, not knowing anyone, and figuring it out, making friends quickly, adapting to the environment around me. So after our Mexico trip, we get back unscathed. We decided to do more. Kept covering in-person rallies. We would go broadcast live from the rallies. And 2007 was also the lead up to a big election year in 2008. And if you go back in 2007, you understand it was the Bush administration. 2007, we had a recession. We were still involved in 2 wars, Afghanistan and Iraq. And generally by that point, the sense was the country's a little tired of a guy named George W. Bush, who was ineligible to run again anyways. But there was this young guy who was making waves named Barack Obama, senator from Illinois, and he was running against Hillary Clinton. On the Republican side, there was a bunch of candidates. No one knew who was going to be the lead. So the station said, why don't you guys go to Iowa? In November of 2007, exactly 1 year before the 2008 election. So because I had gone through these changes, and because I decided to move to Phoenix, and because we decided as a show to go to the Mexican border, here we are now in Iowa, following candidates around. I'd never been to Iowa. It was absolutely amazing to see in person what an Iowa caucus is. Different from the way most of us vote. Most of us vote, put our ballots in, either mail it in or show up at the poll and drop it off or fill it in the day. Caucus in Iowa is different. It's more involved. It takes, a couple hours, 3 hours of your night. You go to a place like a school or a library and you line up behind the candidate you want. Crazy thing is, in the Iowa caucuses, you can move your vote around because there's certain delegates, and what they do is they divide the total number of people in the precinct to get an equal number of delegates. So let's say, for example, it takes you 20 voters to get a delegate. If you have 24 lined up, you're not close to the next delegate because you would need to get all the way to 40. So 4 of the delegates that say pledged to Hillary Clinton could move to Obama and give Obama a delegate if he only had 16. It's weird, but that's how they do it. So to be able to see that was amazing. In fact, we were the first radio station that we're aware of to broadcast live from inside an Iowa caucus. That was Darrell at his finest. Darrell had this way of doing what he wanted because he knew it would work for the radio show or the radio station. So while our station here in Phoenix was covering the Iowa caucus later that year, early next year, so November was the first trip. January, we went back on caucus day. Having the ability to do something that no one else had done is amazing. All because we decided to change. All because we decided to do things differently. So I have this one side of me professionally that was really dialed in. But my personal side of things, not so much. Because 2007 was also another interesting year. If you are a sports fan that grew up in New England, Massachusetts for me. Because 2007 in September, when the New England Patriots season kicked off, was an unforgettable season. So 2006, the football season it was early 2007. It had ended with an upsetting loss to the Indianapolis Colts. The Patriots were up 21-3 in that game, lost the lead, lost the game. So 2007 was like a rebirth year. They changed around the offense, Randy Moss, one of the greatest wide receivers ever to play the games, joining up with Tom Brady. And in September, when that season kicked off, it was great. Patriots go, win the first game, second game, third game, fourth game, fifth game. And as they started to win, you start to get more involved. You're like, wow, this team is really special. They have a fantastic offense. They could win the Super Bowl. And there's nothing better than a sports fan than your team winning the Super Bowl. And it gets even crazier because moving to Phoenix, being far away from the Patriots, not all the games are on TV. However, Amy's cousins, Mrs. Hunter's cousins, live here in Phoenix. And they are New England Patriots fans because they were born and raised in Connecticut, via Iowa, via Phoenix. So now you have the New England Patriots doing really well. There is an identity attached to you if you're a Boston sports fan or a New York sports fan that when your team wins, you win. The whole region wins. It's bragging rights. It's, even though you didn't play in the game, you still get to say that you're the best, you're the champs. So there is that attachment to it. And then if you add a family level to it. And again, Mrs. Hunter and I are brand new to Phoenix 2007. So we start watching the games with Amy's cousins, Eric and Ray. We start to get into it. Because they bought that package where you could watch all the Patriots games. So we would go over their house like every Sunday night, every Sunday afternoon. And we would watch the games. So you're building this relationship with Mrs. Hunter's family while watching the Patriots. So it's very easy to get your emotions attached to the outcomes of these events. And as the season progressed and the Patriots are 8-0 and 9-0, Eric, Ray, and I would start to talk about perfection. The media that covered the Patriots was talking about perfection. It was almost unbelievable. It was almost like, no, it's never going to happen. But it kept happening. They kept winning. Week 12, beating the Eagles by 3 points. The next week, beating the Ravens by 3 points. Going all the way up to the end of the season, the Patriots end 16-0. I promise this all ties into change. Because 2007 is that mirror year we're looking at in the year that I made a big change in moving to Phoenix, but I also was stuck in the past with my emotional attachment to the New England Patriots. And I'll get to that in just a second. But I remember that last game of the season, they played the New York Giants. They were 15-0, the Patriots. And the Giants were, I think they were 9-6. So this was the last game of the season, and it ended up being a tough game. I remember Eric and Ray came over to our house because this was a game, since the Patriots were 15-0, that had the national coverage. And it was a struggle game. It was a tough game. Patriots won by 3 points. But I remember with Eric and Ray, I remember feeling exuberant after 16-0. And the crazier part about all of this is that the playoff run that season was going to end here in Phoenix, technically in Glendale. I think it was the first Super Bowl there. So as the Patriots go 16-0, they win their first couple playoff games, and they end up in the Super Bowl, everyone's excited. Phoenix became New England. So much so that my father and my stepmother Brenda came out to go to the game. My stepbrother and his friend Corey flew out to go to the game. At the time, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood in Phoenix called Ahwatukee. And I've got Mrs. Hunter and me, Bob and Bren, and Ryan and Corey on our tiny little apartment. And I think Ryan, my stepbrother, had another friend with him too, if I remember correctly. So lead up to the Super Bowl, it's this one big party atmosphere, and it's fun. But deep down, I'm nervous. I'm not sure if the Patriots are going to win. I remember how toughly the Giants played them in the last game of the season. So I'm not as exuberant as everybody else seems to be in New England land in Phoenix. Sports fans are trash-talking each other. We're going to win. We're going to win. We're going to knock you off, and so you'll not be perfect, Giants fans. And it's that classic rivalry, Boston versus New York. The New York Giants, New England Patriots, it's on. Now, obviously, the game did not go that way. The Patriots did not finish at a perfect 19-0 running through the playoffs. instead of 18-0, but a 16-0 perfect season. The pressure got to the team. At least that's what they all said. They said it was so much weight to try to be perfect that in the last game, they couldn't keep up. And the reason I bring all of this up is because while I had this significant momentum and change in my life, I was still being held back by worrying about what I could not control. So when the Patriots lost, it was as if somebody died. I'm not even exaggerating about this. I felt so negative, so heavy. It affected me emotionally. When my family got back to my apartment, they went to the game, I did not. And I was mad because I wanted to go to the game, but I couldn't afford a ticket. So I was mad that I didn't get to go until they lost. But everybody came home depressed, dejected. Nobody wanted to say anything because it was like someone died. And I remember that night working with Darrell. I worked hard. I wanted to work hard. 12 hours a day hard sometimes, most of the time. And as a producer on a talk show, you book guests, you help with topic research, you help put the show together. You do a lot of the behind-the-scenes things. So every night, I would be responsible for sending Darrell and Diane, who was on our team, the rundown. What we had plugged in so far, when the guests would be booked, what are the topics that we're going to talk about. We called it the 5 o'clock report, but I often didn't send it till a little bit later at night, just the way that my day was structured. So I would do that on Sunday through Thursday nights. Since the Super Bowl was on a Sunday, I did not do my work, and this is very unlike me. I always do my work, no matter what. Even if I have to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning to get it done, I do it. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's just what I do. But this night I did not do it because I was so emotionally devastated by the Patriots losing. Also something about me, I do not like waking up early. Even though most of my adult life I've had, I struggled through that to do what I got to do. But that next morning, Monday morning, I don't remember my exact wake-up time. Let's call it 5:45 then. 4:30, I was awake, staring at the ceiling. Didn't fall asleep till, 12:30. Couldn't sleep. Slept 4 hours, tired. And I remember writing Darrell an email that night because he asked what the report was. I'm like, sorry, man, my team lost. And he responded, so, something like that. It wasn't quite that dramatic, but his point was, in order to be in the big leagues where we're at in Phoenix, Arizona, do the work. And he was right. So that is still an incredibly important lesson to me because I was so in my emotions, I did not fulfill my obligations. And that felt horrible. Because in that moment, and feeling the Patriots' loss, I realized something very important. I can have nothing to do with that game, and I cannot control it. Why am I giving all of my emotional energy to something I cannot control? Come later to find out, the Stoics talked about this before Jesus was born, like 2,200 years ago. They called it the dichotomy of control because it is a dichotomy. Because you can only really control you. You can control what you think. I know sometimes it doesn't seem that way, but you can. Because you can control what you focus on. And this is something that I've learned because of this moment. That Sunday night post-Super Bowl not doing my work, that Monday morning waking up before the alarm feeling like someone had died. But it's those moments that if you turn them into an opportunity that you can learn from. So weirdly enough, this was the start of a very long process for me on focusing what I can control and what I can't. Because I knew that I had let Darrell down by not doing the work. I hate letting people down. Especially because it's me. I like to work hard. I show up. I do extra things. It's just who I am, my DNA. That day I didn't do it. That day I did not feel like myself. For a reason that was not as serious as someone dying, but I treated it as if it was. So now what I do is I look back. Remember we talked about, if you caught the last couple of episodes, another Stoic principle to view from above, where you zoom out like a drone would and you look at all your decisions and you try to find the patterns of those decisions, both the successful decisions and the not so successful decisions, poor decisions. So, when able to do that, I go back to this moment in 2008 on the 2007 football season, and I realized that was like a rock bottom moment for me when it came to worrying about what I can control. Now, again, it wasn't like I woke up on the Tuesday morning and everything was fantastic, but I knew I needed to change. And the funny thing is, when you're trying to change your body, your mind, your emotion, you almost forget all the times you've changed before. So again, this took me a little while to realize, but these are both very important moments and very important year, 2007, of which there were so many lessons for me, because later on down the line, I was able to look at the Patriots' loss, and I was able to look at what I did in 2007 and how I moved from Farmington to Phoenix, knowing virtually nobody, except for the guy I was working with, who I hung out for a couple of hours in an afternoon, and my boss, who I'd hung out for a couple of hours, who I'd met a couple of times. But I moved anyways. So I was able to look back and I'd be able to zoom out on those decisions and say, okay, Rob, that's how I talk to myself. Hey, Rob, I looked at 2007 and I looked at all the accomplishments that I had and the risks that I took and how I managed those risks. And I was able to start applying them to change my emotional attachment to things that I could not control. Now, even still, in 2023, I'm not perfect, nor will I ever be perfect. But I'm aware. I'm aware because I did the work. So when the pandemic came around in 2020, most of the world freaked out. I didn't. I was like, awesome. I can't go anywhere for like a year. So I stayed home and I worked on myself. Because I believe that life happens for me. I just know that it does. And what that means is that everything that happens in life is an opportunity. So I'm able to look back and zoom out at 2007 to be able to compare moving to Phoenix, taking a risk, working with one of the best hosts to ever do it, going to Mexico, getting surrounded by the Mexican military, covering an election up close and personal, and a whole bunch of other things. All those changes that I went through over the course of that year, in all the years leading up to 2007. All those changes gave me the confidence that I could change my emotional attachment, that I could finally practice what the Stoics were talking about, the dichotomy of control. So, for example, now I watch the Patriot games, and I still root for the Patriots. Yeah, even this year. But I know I can't control it. So, I don't get bogged down or ruin a day because my favorite team lost. Because heartbreak is part of sports until it's not. Until you understand it's a performance. Part of the change for me also came in working on my identity. Because for a long time I identified as a Bostonian. I'm from Boston, outside of Boston. Massachusetts, American history. It meant a lot to be from the state that the American Revolution started in, where the Boston Tea Party was, because you felt close to all of that. So my identity was wrapped up in that, and my identity was subject to challenge when the Patriots lost, because that wasn't just a loss for me, it was a loss for the entire New England region, because sports ebbs and flows, and the emotions ebb and flow with it. And in realizing that, I was able to take some more control of what I can control, and that's me. So it took a lot of work, but in looking back at the changes that I made and how I managed those, I was able to apply those skills to my mind and to my emotions, which is why when I work with my communication clients, we always talk about the dichotomy of control. Because communication is one of those things that only you can control. You can't control what I'm going to say. I can't control what you're going to say. I'd like to. You'd like to. But But here's the point of all of this. Change is hard, but change is also constant. And there are many times in your life where you were forced to change. If you can look back at those changes, whether they were forced or whether you chose them, and you can look at, by zooming out, what you learned from them, from these changes. And if you're facing a change right now that is difficult, challenging you, you can look to how you've changed for wisdom, for advice. You can also ask the same of other people. How did you change? So on one hand, with the career, I just did. At least that's how I looked at it in 2007, 2006, 2000 when I made my first move. It just seemed necessary to achieve what I wanted to achieve, which was being a radio show host. And all of those steps were around that purpose. So it was almost as if those steps didn't matter because I was willing to do whatever it took. And zooming out, understanding that in 2007, I was willing to do whatever it took. Whatever challenge came my way, I knew I could handle it. Because along the way in working with Darrell had very high standards. Standards that I hadn't worked on yet. Because again, I'm 28, 29 years old. And Darrell is teaching me how to do a big league radio show. Some of those conversations were tough. Some of them were like father to son. All of which I needed. Because even though I was so career-driven, I was still lost in many ways in my head. I was diagnosed with depression the first time at 19, second time at 30. So to give you that framework, it was really one long depression that kept going past 30. But in looking at that change and how I managed it, how I accepted those tough conversations with Darrell where he had to tell me he expected more out of me, including the night the Patriots lost the Super Bowl, was really an advancement for me in my own growth. And I still look back at those lessons in 2007. I still use them today because there are other big changes that are happening in my life. There are changes all the time, and I'm ready for these changes. In fact, I embrace the changes because the way I look at change is completely different. And it's all because I've changed so much without even realizing it. But realizing those changes and those effects and those impacts, what that did for me, freedom. For my entire life, adult life anyways, my main mantra when it came to approaching my talk show was work hard, was find the truth. And was around this concept of freedom. Let's go back to Massachusetts, where I was born and raised, the American Revolution. It was all about freedom. So in the last 23 years as a talk show host, I have based my topic selection, my points of view, from the lens of freedom, as far as what it means for you and your relationship with your government. And in my view, over 23 years, freedom, government, and control have a very tricky relationship. Because with freedom comes risk, with freedom comes fear, and those fears are exacerbated by politicians who tell you that they're going to give you safety from the storm. They never do, but it sounds good, and we as humans don't really like to be fearful, so we're always seeking safety. So freedom in and of itself is a tricky relationship because our own natural innate ability is to not be free, to have some level of control, especially in the modern technological world that we live in. But what I've found in 23 years, in zooming out and looking at change and understanding how the Patriots lost propelled me forward to be more in control of my own life, what I found is that I can now take on any challenge. I'm going to have to learn. I'm going to have to adapt. But I now have confidence to change. I now have confidence in my own abilities because I did this work. And because all along the way, sticking with my purpose, the thing that I loved the most, professionally at least, being a talk radio show host and being the best that there could be. Taking that step back to work with Darrell Ankarlo so I could be better, which I am today because of Darrell. fact, I have from that Mexico trip I was telling you about, right here as I record this podcast, it's like a montage of photographs. Darrell ended up writing a book called Another Man's Sombrero that tells the story of this Mexican adventure. Half the book is that. The pictures are right there that I look at every day. Because that was a massive change that we all handled so well. Because oddly, we knew what we were in control of. We knew what we weren't. So when able to look back at those lessons in that zoom out view from above, I can take those lessons of change and apply them to today. I can apply them to the Stoic principle of what I'm in control of and what I'm not. Because sometimes I say things the wrong way. Sometimes I don't say them exactly how I mean to. And sometimes other people get upset or react to those. I can't control that. All I can do is take that and say, interesting. What can I learn from that? Life happens for you. So next time I know, there's a better way to deliver the line, better way to say it. And it's all from doing this inner work. It's all from being willing to go back and understand that, man, I'd done lost my mind and my emotions after the Patriots lost. Why? I mean, it just seems so silly in hindsight to give all of this emotional energy and attention to a football team of which I do not play on. Because of what it represents for me personally, because of what it represents for my identity as being a Bostonian, a Patriots fan. But it's going through those changes that allows you to change now. So it allows you to say, look, all the changes you've made, you moved to 6 states in 7 years. You get up the crack of dawn in the morning to go to work when hardly anyone else is awake. But you do it because you love it. So what I ended up doing is loving change. What I ended up doing is loving the process of change. Because I took what I already loved, my ability to change because of my profession, and I apply it to my own life. Because that second element of freedom is not really the relationship that you have with your government, but what they allow you to do. The personal freedom aspect. Personal freedom to me means that you're in control. And you understand that you're in control. Because when you understand what you can control and what you can't, you know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at. You know what you need to learn, you know how to learn it. Or you can find out how to learn it. Because you're willing to change. And being willing to change is what personal freedom is all about. Being willing to change is one element I've found to fulfillment and happiness, which seems to be the journey for me. Maybe it is for you as well. Point is, was there a moment in your life where your emotions overwhelmed you? Can you look back at that now and examine it? Not from an emotional standpoint, but from an analysis standpoint. And are there other areas of your life where you've learned from that you can apply to that emotion, especially if it still sits with you? Because it wasn't just the Patriots loss. After 2007, there was many more things that my emotions got wrapped up in, even though I couldn't control them. Like getting fired from that same job many years later. Having to start all over again. But I'd already been through enough where, yeah, it bothered me for a couple of days, but I noticed, I got fired in 2014. So 7 years after this. But I noticed how much easier that was to manage because I had started this work to understand the dichotomy of control. And I'm only in control of me. So what I did in that moment is I got a gig, valet parking cars, which was a lot of fun, actually. It was good detox from radio. And then I started working with the station I'm at now. Started doing some fill-ins. Was up for a job, didn't get that job, but got a different job. News show at 5 a.m. Not exactly where I wanted my career to go, but the love was there. So I did it, and I did it to the best of my ability. Because that was within my control. I was able to control how I approached that job, even though I had to get up at 2:30 in the morning. But I love stories like this because it's in all of us. We all have successes. We all have failures. I like to keep a success list handy. Items like this, moving to Phoenix in 2007 and what it taught me about my ability to change and adapt environments. I love that. And I love being able to take those lessons that I've already learned and applying to areas where I haven't. Because truth be told, for a lot of my life, I did not pay attention to my emotions as far as thinking I could control or manage them, maybe is a better word. But I can. That is the ultimate freedom. To understand that you're in control of you. And that's it. So be the best version of you that you can be. And if you're not that version, how do you get there? What lessons from your success list can you look at and compare them to your humble list? That's the failure list. Because sometimes if you only look at your success list, that ego gets a little bit out of control. Mine certainly has in the past and still occasionally does. And I got to remind myself of my failures. I got to remind myself that I had to valet cars for a little while. Because that humility from those lessons lessens your judgment of others and their struggles, but it also frees you from judging yourself. Also part of personal freedom. So I went back to 2007 very specifically because that was a pivotal moment in my life. In the last 3 episodes now, we've talked about pivotal moments. That was a pivotal year for me to understand how to change, how I can change, how I do change, and how I can apply those lessons to a different area of my life, my thoughts and my emotions. All courtesy of a New England Patriots loss, a perfect season spoiled. And the way that game went is a lot like life. If you remember the game, there was the famous catch at the end. Eli Manning on the run, throws this ball up in the air, and David Tyree catches it with one hand on his helmet, survives a tackle, doesn't drop the ball, and that was it. Game over. Disappointment. But life sometimes has that. It's what you do with those moments that matter, because that's what you're in control of. My name is Rob Hunter, sharing my stories in hopes that maybe you can learn. Maybe you can apply these lessons that I've learned the hard way and you can learn them a little bit faster. Because Lord knows, every day is a learning opportunity, today included. Thank you for being here on Equal Matters. We practice realism, so I'm going to tell you about me. We're going to get to the bottom of some stories. We're going to talk to interesting people. All part of that realism. Because I view most of the world, especially the social media world, as an altered reality, almost a metaverse. Because your reality is what you experience. We get to experience so much more with videos on our phone, text on our phone, than we used to at any other point in history. So our view of reality is a little bit skewed, even so much so that politics, to me, at this point, is becoming a reality show. And we all know reality shows aren't real. Equal Matters, realism. Depth. This was a process to go through, and any change is a process to go through because it requires depth. Depth of understanding. So we stand for that here at Equal Matters. And then knowledge. Sometimes it's going to be knowledge about what life is like on an aircraft carrier with my main man, Justin Cross, working on the flight deck, or knowledge about being a New York City police officer that we talked to New York Rob about, or knowledge of how me, one man, managed his emotions to put himself in control and enjoy the concept of personal freedom. Because you have changed. Some changes you've probably done well, some not so much. All of that offers lessons to apply now. So thanks again for being here. I am a communications coach. I have an online communications course called Master Your Message that's designed to help you perform better because it's your communication that matters. And that communication with yourself, which we focus on in Master Your Message, is also part of managing the dichotomy of control, knowing that you can control you, and we really hone in on that conversation you have with yourself. So we got the online course for you. You want to accelerate that learning, we can set that up too. I'm a coach. I teach my program. And I'll give you a process before we get out of here. This is the process I use, process I created. I studied personal development tools, spent a lot of money investing in myself. And I basically found some tools that work, but I had to make my own tool to walk you through what I walked through, right? And understanding 2007 and understanding that I made these big changes and I can use those lessons of how I changed to not be so emotionally attached to something I can't control that can ruin my day and get me in trouble at work. It's the rap process. I'm a huge hip-hop fan, So my process, write a rap, like your Nas, like your Tupac. R stands for recognize. Recognize what's going on. Recognize what happened. The New England Patriots loss. A in rap, assess. For me, that was a big feeling in my gut. It was a big feeling in my heart. So I knew I had these big feelings associated with this loss. P in rap, recognize, assess. P is process. I figured out my process. I give myself time. I have a certain spot in my house. I write. I journal. I just let the pen do the work. Let's see what comes out. And then I look at it. Oftentimes I do that. I have major breakaways that I can apply today. So if nothing else, maybe today you leave here with that tool that you can use. Write your raps. Process the way you want to process. And manage your emotions and thoughts. If you want more information, you want to work with me, please go to paintedporchstrategies.com/Rob. paintedporchstrategies.com/Rob, or you can send me an email, rob@equalmatters.com. Have a fantastic day, night, weekend, wherever you're at. And remember, you are in control. Good night.